I'm Holly GLOGAU Morgan, author of the Midnight Morning trilogy, and coming to you from Shenandoah, outside of Shenandoah National Park in Virginia, where it's just me, the raccoons, and the bears.
Hello, everyone. I'm Stacey Overby. I am the author of the Black Ops series. Book 1 is out, Book 2 is coming out, and I'm here in Twin Cities, Minnesota, where, yes, it does actually melt the snow sometimes.
I'm Jim Nettles. I write fiction, nonfic, founder for Author Essentials, which is author education, author services stuff. I am, by profession, I work in business and tech consulting, so I get to play with a lot of both sides of the house, both writing about it and doing some of the science and tech stuff. So, and you're coming to me from my office that's a disaster area in Charlotte, North Carolina.
My name is Jason Morris. I'm a filmmaker. I'm from the Bay Area, California. I actually recently just, co-wrote a book with somebody. It's a book of plays, but primarily direct films and produce and write scripts.
I'm V.S. Holmes. I created the Nell Bentley books, which is basically lesbian archaeologists in space. And I myself work as an archaeologist, which is why you have the lovely hotel room behind me, because I'm in the field right now in southern New England.
So I wanted to read to you guys to start with the definition that I found of science fiction and see how apropos you think it really is. The definition that I found says deals principally with the impact of actual or imagined science upon society or individual.
And going with your definition, I mean, I could argue that you could look at any of the classics. You know, if you want to go back to Plato, you want to go back to Roman literature. You know, if you go back to Nordic literature, a lot of the fables, the tales, you find a lot of technology, some of which was a blend of what was available during the day and a blend of what people projected they wanted to have happen. I mean, you can see early aspects of robotics and things in those cultures. I mean, so when you talk about the literature and we talk about science fiction, for me, it's a question, are we talking about true hard science fiction where at least the science has to be reasonable and plausible? Or are we having fun with space opera because we got space wizards and laser swords? So
Not so specific.
not specific at all.
Yeah.
Most people recognize Mary Shelley as a pioneer in this aspect. Frankenstein is really the hallmark or benchmark of where science fiction kind of fostered and became more of what it is now.
Frankenstein as being a horror film more so than a science fiction film, when it's really very science fiction.
It is.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, I mean,
Sci-fi.
like Alien, I feel like a lot of times sci-fi, when it doesn't become the space opera sci-fi, a lot of times it can hold hands with horror because the things that the characters are encountering are so sometimes literally alien, but also kind of horrific, whether we created them or some other being created them. So I feel like there is a heavy overlap most of the time.
Oh, absolutely. I totally agree with that. I mean, because if you think about the idea of science fiction and in that definition, right, it's about science, right, and how science affects our world or could affect our world. Well, science is about understanding our world. Good, the bad, the ugly, all of it.
Right, all of it.
I did read, or not read, I heard when I was doing a podcast with Sisters of Sci-Fi podcast, Stephanie, the host, she mentioned this sci-fi story that she'd read that I think she said it was in the 14th century that was written by a nun. And she didn't know the name of it. She's like madly trying to track it down. She read it once. So like if anyone has leads, please send them. And the level of technology that was in this story for the time period was just incredible, and a lot of it was like a little eerily accurate.
Oh yeah.
Well, I mean, if you want to go to that time period, look at some of Leonardo da Vinci's sketches.
Oh yeah.
So if we look at it necessarily from an art or from a fiction standpoint, but an art standpoint, you know, art inspires reality. If you look at some of the predictions that came about, the things that he tried to build, the things that he didn't, you know, that's why I say it's really hard to say where one begins and the other ends, because a lot of the time what we see as science going through the days, or what would pass for science in the times, we see started coming out of what people's imaginations believed at the time. So it's really a hard mix between the two.
Those forward thinkers, you know, ended up, it really could have been, you know, labeled as science fiction. That they were just taking what they knew and making logical leaps with it.
You look at the 1960s Star Trek, the originals, and you look at the technology they had that was, oh, it's space opera and, you know, that can't happen type stuff. And then you look at what we have today.
Where did it all start for you? Where did your love of science fiction begin? What are some of the things you remember from the beginning that you really gravitated toward, that you have shaped you?
I love that we're all smiling as soon as we ask it. We're like, oh, yes.
Oh, we've got stories.
Yes, there are stories.
I'll start. I was born into a family that loved Star Trek, and I was born the year Star Wars came out. So some of my earliest memories were sitting in a movie theater at like age 3 watching Empire Strikes Back. So it started really early there, and Mom was really into the original Star Trek. And as I started to read more, because I was an advanced reader, as I started reading more and more advanced books, she was literally dragging me into the science fiction area and be like, here's this, here's this, here's this, here's Trek, here's this, here's Star Wars. And then when I turned 12, a close friend of the family who was also in sci-fi handed me all 13 Hammer Mill paper boxes full of science fiction paperback.
Wow.
Wow.
Nice.
And I didn't come out of my room for months.
I would say for me, a lot of it actually came more from TV and film than from books. I struggled when I was growing up. I really struggled with reading sci-fi because it was the very hard sci-fi with, you know, all the technical stuff, and I'm a little, well, maybe a lot ADHD, and it just really helped. I struggled to focus. I struggled to be able to get through the tech to read the story. So I grew up, Star Trek: The Next Generation was on, and it was once a week. That was when we could eat in the living room, because we would all go sit in the living room and watch that. But it was Doctor Who, it was Star Wars, and I was born into a military family, so we had no money. We couldn't actually go see it, but you know, I was coming out, and it was Star Trek, and it was all these things, and a lot of that actually came from my dad, because my dad really loved that stuff.
So for me, I would probably say it started with TV and film. A lot of it was the old bad B movies, you know, the sci-fi B movies that came from outer space, you know, and again, we're kind of
some of those.
Oh yeah, and I mean, I loved those. And when I started reading hard science fiction, I started with Heinlein. I mean, Heinlein is still one of my favorite authors. There's still a lot of it I'll go back and read, you know, once or twice a year. But that's a lot of where I started. But I mean, because I'm the old guy, I did see Star Wars in the theater in 1977 as probably a little too young, but oh well, you know. But I mean, I saw the original Battlestar Galactica.
Another good one.
You know, oh yeah, in the theater, and I saw I saw the original Star Trek movie in the theater. But I mean, as a little kid, I remember watching the reruns of the original Star Trek, Lost in Space. You know, a lot of the campy stuff, but there was a lot of. It was fun, but it also made you at least consider, how do those things happen?
I mean, it was pretty clear cut for me. It was Back to the Future. As a kid, I could just watch that movie over and over and over again. My sister was into, like romantic comedies and stuff, and she would watch Can't Buy Me Love like 1,000 times. But I would just Back to the Future, watch to the end, rewind it, watch it again over and over again. And I don't know, I just couldn't get enough. There was just something about that movie that just pulled me in. And then there's a lot of other, probably more adventure sort of oriented, like shows like maybe, I mean, I know Lost in Space and stuff is very sci-fi, but it had like this very strong adventure sort of element to it, or like Journey to the Center of the Earth sort of stuff, that just had a lot of that sort of wonder to it that I didn't see in a lot of other films. And as I got older, I started digging into some of the other, older B movies from the 50s and stuff like that I really enjoy. And I'm not a heavy reader in terms of like narrative type stuff. But when I do read narrative books, it's usually has something to do with sci-fi or horror.
So mine really started because I wasn't allowed to like watch TV pretty much when I was little until about age like 12, 15. But I was allowed to watch Cosmos and the Nature Channel and Nova. Those were like that was my Sunday scripture were those shows. And it really started for me from like the sci part. My dad was a pilot, and we watched Contact together. And of course, it's like a wicked father-daughter film anyways. And just the idea of flight and this like faith in humanity, where we're going, and science and space. That's really where my love for it started. And not so much the fiction-y part, though obviously, Contact is a bit fiction. And then later on with Interstellar, which is, I feel like, the spiritual successor. So I think just those two things coupled with just this curiosity about where we're going, which is, part of why I'm an archaeologist, I think, just really hammered it home. And that, I think it's more the technology and what we're capable of as a species is where I fell in love with it.
So one of the things about science fiction that always seems to have, I mean, there's lots of tropes to science fiction, and we'll get into the what you must have, what you can't have idea of it. But there is a rabid fandom that comes with the responsibility of being a science fiction storyteller. And the fandom will call you out, and they will be very, they'll be vile sometimes. Are you guys along for that ride? How do you view this aspect of this opportunity to tell stories in this genre?
Not with the trilogy. No one has said anything yet. But okay, there they go. Every time. But I just finished up a Star Trek challenge because I play Star Trek Online. I'm a story master, blah, blah, blah. They wanted me to write my main character's life down in third person, short 5-paragraph segments from birth until current time where we're role playing. Once that gets out a bit, I have a feeling there's going to be a lot of that going on.
But you joined that knowing that was going to happen, right? So.
Yes. And the rule with the role players was if you can't prove it in memory alpha, you have to prove it in memory beta. So some of this stuff is provable.
Kind of.
If I've ever run across anything like that, just in conversations between people, arguments between different, franchises or something, but not in my work. I think personally, I just think if you do, I think film is a little different than books, though. You have more time with books, and with film, you can sort of suspend your disbelief easier for a shorter period of time, and they don't really realize plot holes and issues till afterwards, which could be good or bad. I think that if you do, a reasonable amount of research and put enough time into it, I think that if people enjoy the story that you're telling, regardless of the science behind it, cut people a break.
Not science fiction.
No, I think that whole idea is just sad in a lot of ways too. I mean, I haven't run into it, but just this idea that, oh my gosh, you've got one detail that's not quite lining up the way this did over here, that did, or whatever, is just like, come on. What about the story? It's about the stories.
I've definitely
Well,
run
I mean-
into some stuff myself. So part of it is because it's hard sci-fi. It's actual science, but a lot of it's archaeology, which, you know, some of the fans are like, well, there's not as much science in here, and you know, the first two books take place on Earth, and while the third one takes place in space, I think a lot of people felt a little bit betrayed that like this hard sci-fi wasn't like light speed and that sort of thing. But that being said, most of the flack I get is because I'm introducing a very diverse cast into sci-fi, and while a lot of sci-fi is like really progressive because obviously it's the future, you know, some people struggle with that. I think a lot of people respect the fact that, you know, my science is pretty sound because it's what I do for a living. But we'll see when they get to the third book and it's, you know, space archaeology and, you know, beings made out of sound. So I'm waiting for
It's got to be
that.
a hard thing. It's always the sequels that get the short end of the stick because you're trying to progress and take it into another realm, and people are like, no, give me more of the same. And it's like, if you do that, then they're bored and it's not as good as the first book kind of thing anyway.
Well, there's a reason for that, right? I mean, because everybody so loved the first book or the first movie, that the sequel has to live up to that hype, and there's not many that can do that.
No, it's it's an impossible task.
It's all about what are you trying to do with the story. If you're trying to do really true hard science fiction, where science is the first part of it, and you're telling a fictional narrative to get your point across, that fan base is going to be a lot harder on you than if you're telling space opera that is wrapping the story around the technology, because the technology is what enables you to tell the story. And I think it really depends on what your fan base is and what you're trying to do with the story. But you're going to always, if you have enough people read your stuff or watch your stuff or whatever the case may be, if you haven't pissed somebody off along the way, you're not trying hard.
So where does everybody stand on the real versus fake aspect of it? Does it have to have at some level some sort of foundation of realism to it in order for it to be successful as science fiction?
Yeah, I think so. I think in any story, really, there's got to be some sort of level of grounding that you can relate to. And I think it's just harder with science fiction because you can, I mean, your imagination, it really is a limit, but you know, like we've already talked about, people really look for those issues and those errors.
I think it goes back to that, the suspension of disbelief. And I write fantasy as well. So, you know, it's much easier with fantasy because you can be like, it's magic. But I think in sci-fi, it's just, you know, like magic and technology, it's the same thing. We just understand technology and we don't understand magic. You know, obviously that's like a huge generalization. But I think if you have at least, it makes sense in the world. It makes sense with the world's technology. It makes sense with whatever power they've harnessed. As long as it's not necessary to go into those really deep details for your actual narrative. I think as long as you stick to that, like within the rules, don't break your rules, then you're pretty good for the most part. But obviously, if you're talking like high tech, that's, you know, that can get a little hairy.
It's interesting that you brought up magic, though, because the quote from Arthur Clarke about technology being indistinguishable, any sufficiently advanced technology, is basically indistinguishable from magic. Oh, yeah. So I think you can get away with a lot if it's out there.
Well, I think the real magic word is plausibility. You know, it's not necessarily believability, but if you're having to create a technology to support the narrative, whether it's, you know, star drives, you know, hyperdrives, whatever the case may be, when you come up with those technologies that enable the rest of the story, then what you're looking at is, are you wrapping the narrative around it to make the rest of your science plausible?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just that idea and feeding into that idea of technology really is magic when you don't understand it. You know, so being able to really blend those pieces is really cool.
So what are some of the tropes that you embrace wholeheartedly in what you create? Are there certain ones that you stand by, that you go, okay, this is what I'm going to use this? Yeah.
Well, somebody said it a minute ago. It was sort of the Jurassic Park thing. We spent so much time trying to figure out how to do it. We didn't ask ourselves if we should, sort of thing. And I think it's a super important one, and I try to put that sort of piece in the things that I do, not only relating to sci-fi stuff, but just about anything, because it's a great question and motivator for characters.
Yeah, I think a lot of mine really kind of inadvertently has become a reflection of some of what's going on in society, of who do we take care of? Who are the valued people? You know, and just okay, you're a value, you know, you're of more value, so to speak, than somebody else. Well, what does that mean? What do you get out of it? And what does that mean for the rest of us?
I try to go into the layers of who knows best, which is something I think is explored a lot in sci-fi when we have more advanced either societies that are alien or human. And I like to explore that partially because as an archaeologist, that's something that we come across a lot, because we're seeing a lot of different intersections of culture, both in the past, that we're studying, because I study Native American technology. So that, meeting colonists, but also, I work with a lot of mostly white people. And so it's the intersection of that as we're taking care of someone else's culture and as we're working with tribal reps. So I like to explore that both on that level, because there's archaeology in my book, but also on a greater level of like, okay, so these massive beings, do they actually know what's best for us? Or do we know, even though we don't have the same knowledge or technology that they have?
I rely on how do people react to the different technologies that come up. And that's something I do not only, in fiction. I do that for nonfiction. I deal with that with clients. We deal with that implementing technologies. I mean, this is one of those things that's really kind of a handy skill, is looking and seeing how will people use or react to what we're rolling out and what we're doing. When you refer to it as user experience, I mean, I kind of look at that perspective of what are the implications for the technology that I'm introducing? What are the implications to the people, the society? How do I get to go break it? And what's the aftermath? Because I don't believe in that idea of, okay, it's the end of the half-an-hour sitcom and everything's back to normal. No, it's what's your new normal? We blew everything up. Zombies are running loose, cats and dogs living together, whatever the case may be. What's the aftermath? How do people recover from that or react, or what's their new normal?
I lean towards just putting in warnings of what could happen if we continue on this track, kind of thing.
One of the things about science fiction genre that has in common with horror in most respects too, it's kind of funny, they mirror one another in this aspect of it, is it's not afraid to make fun of itself. Its campiness is its strength, right? I mean, so what do you all feel about campiness? Do you need to find some campiness in what you write? Is that important to you? Is that something that really matters when it comes to this genre?
Totally. I mean, completely, totally. Campy, a lot of aspects of camp, started with queer society. And because I write queer characters, it's filled with camp. But it's also, against this backdrop of like, okay, we're all going to die now. So I definitely try and go there, but I go there through the lens of the characters, not so much in the meta way, if that makes sense, because I think a lot of horror is much more meta in its campiness. But I definitely do it through the character's eyes, especially because like it's really fun to be subversive with like the angry lesbian trope and the like we move it after the first date trope and things like that.
Nice.
I wrote a murder mystery where somebody's killing gnomes and turning them into garden statues. Yes, I am a firm believer in the camp.
So with the way that our technology is rapidly advancing and who we are and how quickly that we come out with something and then something tops it, and is the future of science fiction in danger? Are you worried that you'll be outdated? Like Jason, you mentioned Back to the Future, and there's a lot of people right now who are debunking Back to the Future because of the timelines that have been created, right? A lot of Kubrick stuff is an example of that, so is there a concern for you guys when you're writing this? Do you have to go so far out? And how do you handle that idea that the technology is going to catch up to you eventually?
I've actually been fighting with this with a new series that was supposed to have come out last year, where we were fighting about the fact of, oh yeah, nobody will ever believe this. You're going way too far. And I was like, no, this is really where it's going. No, because part of the basis of it is cryptocurrency. And I started the draft about 3 years ago. It was designed around the premise of it is that the middle management of the Illuminati all get laid off, and some of them survive. But part of the basis was they had sort of an international cryptocurrency that they used that was secure. They used it to do currency manipulation. They used it to manipulate the stock markets and all these sorts of fun things. And they were like, and most everybody I was dealing with was like, I don't even know what you're talking about here. And about the time it was supposed to be released is when Bitcoin, of course, exploded. And everybody all of a sudden, of course, was a cryptocurrency expert. And now they're looking and going, yeah, you didn't go far enough. And I'm like, you would, okay.
I think progress is good. I think that like the art imitate life sort of thing comes into play here. I think that there's plenty of things like in Back to the Future, any futuristic kind of movie that end up becoming reality and some things don't. And I just think it can only help open your imagination even wider as these things become more prominent and new technology emerges and things like that. I think it could only help.
Whatever we write now may or may not happen. It may be realistic, it may not, but those advances just give us cause to use our imaginations even more to see what else we can come up with.
I read something interesting recently about how disabled people have this sort of leg up, so to speak, with sci-fi, because we have to think about solving problems in a sort of more unique way than average society. And that's sort of where I go with my sci-fi, because I'm a disabled person myself, and so I'm trying to solve those problems. And also like, well, what would it look like if society were completely accessible for whatever it happens to be? And I think that ingenuity is sort of proof that sci-fi will always keep advancing with science, because if we weren't creating new technology, I don't think we'd have the capacity to be creating new sci-fi, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Now, working as a disabled author, as somebody who's working through a terminal genetic illness, it is we really do have to be more creative, because we're just trying to survive our day to day here. But I have taken those challenges and I've actually applied those in the Midnight to Morning trilogy, and then Song of Sarai is the new work in progress is about. It is a sci-fi and about a disabled teenager.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm having to think future tech. How would this go about even being fixed?
And it even opens up questions like, okay, you've got a disability, right? What if we had the technology to fix it? Should we?
Mm-hmm.
How does that change our society and our lives, both individually and as human beings? Because all of a sudden now we can just go poof.
But see, I think that goes to where I think the other big advantage of science fiction is it serves a duty not only for what can the technology do, but it's also an ethical study. So we get to look at and use science fiction as a way of exploring how are all the ways that this can just go wrong. If we look at Asimov and the 3 laws, and then 4 laws, because the 3 laws didn't work. But if we look at all the different ways, because that's part of science fiction, is you can't just have it work right all the time. Something's got to go wrong. So the question becomes, if I have all the best technology, if I have all the best toys, if I can do all these different things, then how can that go wrong?